Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Journalists for Sale. Today, we're joined by Michael Brenner, Professor Michael Brenner. He's a professor emeritus of international affairs at the University of Pittsburgh and a fellow of the Center for Transatlantic Relations at Johns Hopkins. He was the director of international relations and global studies program at the University of Texas, and he's the author of numerous books and over 100 articles and published papers. Thank you, Professor Brenner, for being here with us today.
Well, I'm very pleased to join you.
As we are to have you. You've discussed at length the irrationality and delusion of Western empire in your recent articles. You've used examples from Ukraine and Gaza to demonstrate, I think, what you called it like a detachment from reality. So I wanted to ask, as Iran has responded to Israel's bombing of their consulate in Damascus with a barrage of drone strikes that did little to no damage to Israel. I saw some commentators like Glenn Greenwald saying that this was actually by design in hopes of not provoking too much of a reaction from Israel. Uh, President Biden has promised not to support offensive actions against Iran, but he also has pledged support for Israel, full support for Israel and its defenses against Iran. And, in terms of U.S. foreign policy, the lines between what is considered defense and offensive operations are somewhat blurry, I guess you could say. So, what are your thoughts on this? And is this a moment of rationality for the Biden administration or just an example of the typical lunacy that you've written about?
Well, I think we're at a moment of truth for both Washington, the Biden administration, and the Israeli government. It's both a moment of truth. It's a moment of truth because they're in a quandary. They're in a dilemma. There's sort of strategies in regard to the multiple crises in the Middle East, crises which was sparked, of course, by the events of October 7th and the subsequent Israeli reaction, have failed. And the Iranian attack has sort of punctuated that failure. In fact, you might say it's added another facet to that failure. But I think in order to begin to delineate the current situation, and the nature of the very fundamental and probably fateful, if not fatal, choices facing Washington and Jerusalem, we have to understand what happened in terms of the Iranian attack on Saturday. Unfortunately, but predictably, the mainstream media's sort of coverage represents a distortion, in part willful, in part due simply to lazy journalism. In other words, the headline, which in effect you paraphrase, is that the Iranians launched a massive drone and missile assault and that it was a technical failure. That's not true. And the very brief summary assessment and appraisal of what happened is not based upon my own knowledge because I really don't specialize in these matters, nor do I have sort of exceptional sources directly. But I do know people and have read and spoken with people who do have those credentials. In fact, people like Scott Ritter, who served in very high positions in the U.S. government, and in Ritter's case, chief inspector for the UN in the wake of the 1991 Gulf War. And they all sort of agree on both the sort of technical assessment and an interpretation of what it means in terms of the strategic constellation in the region. Let me see if I can sort of paraphrase what they say and to do it in summary fashion. Uh, First, it does seem as if there was communication between Washington and Tehran. We don't know the exact form it took, perhaps through intermediaries, in which the Iranians made it known what their intention was. Their intention was not to wreak enormous damage on Israel. Rather, it was to demonstrate their capabilities and for this to serve as a warning for Israel if they were to seriously consider further escalation, or even if they were to consider further actions directed at the Iranian state, actions of the sort which in the past the mullahs have pretty much accepted with a degree of passivity, they would respond in a more formidable fashion. So what they did was they sent three waves of attack. First were the drones. Now, drones take 3 to 4 hours to reach their target when launched from Iran to Israel. So if you really wanted to do damage, you wouldn't signal it by sending, missiles. Well, drones are not exactly, missiles. You wouldn't use weaponry, which in fact announces itself and gives yourself ample time to prepare your defenses. Defenses that were activated by both Israel and the United States, and in a subordinate role, the French, the British, all operating from sea in the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. The reason why you do that is twofold. First, it was based on this sort of understanding to convey the message that this was not an all-out attack, but it was meant to send a message. Right? Two, the response by the elements of the Israeli Iron Shield, as well as by the American Aegis system base at sea, reveals their capabilities. And in the modern age of electronic warfare, that is critical, because that then enables you to do one or two things in subsequent attacks. Either you try to destroy them, because you know where they are located, you know what their electronic signature is, or you try to evade them. So that's exactly what the Russians have done through their air assaults and missile assaults in Ukraine over the last 18 months or so. Then these were followed by cruise missiles, which are faster than the drones, and it was timed in such a way that the cruise missiles and the drones would arrive simultaneously. Although this was not meant to overwhelm Israeli defenses, anti-missile defenses, but rather to reveal more about Israeli capabilities and their locations and their electronics, et cetera, right? And so almost all of the cruise missiles, as well as the drones, were shot down, as the Iranians expected. And then they followed it up, though, and here it becomes more consequential, with ballistic missiles. And the Iranians actually have an inventory of ballistic missiles of varying degrees of sophistication. Most of I forget how many ballistic missiles, it wasn't very many, was it something like 30 or so, was a mix. And some of the older, less sophisticated models were intercepted. But the big news is that the more sophisticated ballistic missiles were able to evade both the Israeli missile shield, anti-missile shield, and the super sophisticated American electronic shield, which was operated out of a base in the Negev desert by Americans. And they failed. And so the Iranians demonstrated that they could, if they wished, to hit any target in Israel without Israel and or the American allies be able to shoot it down. And that highest class of Iranian missiles has two characteristics. One, apparently, although technical people are not entirely sure about this, were hypersonic. You know, hypersonic missiles is the kind that Russia has developed and which the United States does not possess, and trying to catch up. They come at such a speed as to make it impossible for even the most sort of sophisticated defenses to intercept them. The other feature was something like I believe they call maneuverable entry. What it means is that the warhead, the missile warhead, has built into it such intelligence, right, that it can see an anti-missile missile coming at it and change its course to evade it. And apparently, well, it has been shown. There is one video uh, which depicts what happened when the Iranians attacked this sort of air base in the Negev, where the American, which is both where the American sophisticated equipment was located and the base from which the Israelis had launched their F-35s, which struck the Iranian consulate in Damascus. And you can see the missile is headed towards the base. You see the anti-ballistic missile trying to intercept it online, and the incoming missile does a sort of jog in dogleg. The anti-ballistic missile flies harmlessly past it. The incoming missile resumes its previous trajectory and it hits the base. Now, so what we know, and just to sum it up, is that 7 of those sophisticated ballistic missiles did hit that base. 4 hit another Israeli air base in the Negev. 1 destroyed a Mossad sophisticated communications site in the Golan Heights, and 1 actually hit the building in which was located the unit of the IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, that they believe organized the attack in Damascus. Total casualties, by the way, is 1 person wounded. So the aim was not to cause great damage or to kill many people. It was rather to show that you cannot defend against our missiles, and if you up the ante, we can take out your infrastructure, we can take out the Knesset building, we can take out anything we wish. And that apparently has come as a great shock to both the Israelis and to the Americans. And that combined with other unexpected and developments, you know, in the current hostilities, is what has created this extraordinary sort of dilemma for Israeli leaders and for the Biden administration. And we can get into that as you wish.
Yeah, so from examining this previous or this recent event with Iran, it seems like Israel's continuing to use these sort of events and October 7th as sort of justifications for them being victims of unprovoked attacks and kind of spinning it in this way in order for them to justify their continued actions in terms of what they're doing in Gaza and their military attacks on places like the embassy in Damascus. So how I'm just curious, what do you think is like how much what's the logic left in that? How much further can they go in terms of the Netanyahu government in terms of using these events as ways to paint themselves justified in doing these things, but now there's actual there's potential for actual action against them in the way that Iran demonstrated.
Well, I mean, the cardinal strategic fact of life is for the Israelis is that their overall strategy has failed or is failing on all fronts. They've been unable to achieve their objective in Gaza. They've been unable to eliminate Hamas. Hamas still has thousands and thousands of fighters
But is
underground.
sorry, just to interrupt, is that do you believe that that's their actual objective, or are we really witnessing the failure of their actual objective? Because if their objective is to eliminate Hamas, then they're failing. But if it's the ethnic cleansing and
Well,
removing
yes,
displacement
it should go
without,
together. I mean, they wanted to. They there was a objective which was built into the Zionist project going back 80, 100 years. In effect, to establish a Jewish dominion over all of the land between the river and the sea. Now, the U.S. Congress, in its usual sort of ignorance and hubris, has just voted a resolution, the fact that anybody who uses that term is labeled anti-Semitic. That term was first used by the Zionists, and that exact term and those exact words is incorporated in the charter of the Likud party. Anybody can look it up, but Congress people are much better at opening their mouths and making noises than they are looking and reading or hearing. So yes, and Netanyahu in the past, going back some time, has talked in those terms, and the current government, a number of members of the government, has said as much. So yes, so you had a dual objective, and that is to reestablish Israel's sense, give reality to Israel's sense of and desire for total security by cleansing all of Palestine of Palestinians, whether by expelling them, which was the objective beginning in October, right, into the Sinai Desert, and to expel some of the, at least in the beginning, some of the West Bank residents into Jordan. And we should remind ourselves something which has been overlooked. It was the position of the United States government to support and to encourage the expelling of the Gazans into the Sinai Desert. Secretary, and this is a matter of public record, it's not opinion, it's not speculation. Secretary of State went some weeks after October 7th, but still in the month of October, paid a visit to Cairo, in Egypt, and to King Abdullah in Jordan, and pressed them, in effect, to open the gates and allow hundreds of thousands, if not a million, of Palestinians to vacate Gaza. And in fact, in Egypt, he held out a number of enticements to President Sisi, including writing off tens of billions of debt which Egypt owes the United States, and a readiness to lobby on their behalf for the IMF to write off other billions which Egypt owes the fund. And Sisi told him nothing doing. The thought of having 1 million refugees that would be a breeding ground for jihadi terrorists, which his government's already trying to suppress in Sinai, was intolerable. In addition to which, he knew that if he were to accept that, he'd be overthrown because popular opinion in Egypt is so intense in a way that no government that would accept a proposition like that no matter how autocratic, how ruthless, could stand. And the same thing in regard to King Abdullah. So the Israelis still harbor this hope. The talk is they are going to attack Rafah, and the humanitarian gesture is intended to move, since they can't kick them into the Sinai Desert, is to move them along a strip along the Mediterranean coast near where they're building that pier or jetty or whatever they call it, and have them all live in tents there. So in other words, you move hundreds of thousands of people from tents in Rafah to tents 40 miles away, and you would call that humanitarian gesture, and then you level Rafah. Now, of course, Hamas has less of a tunnel network in Rafah, from what we understand, but they're not standing around. They won't be standing around or ready to be shelled and shot by the Israelis. So that's the failure there, double failure, failure of two interlocking objectives. One, getting rid of the ethnically cleansing Gaza, and two, destroying Hamas. Neither one is now at all feasible. Second objective was to somehow neutralize Hezbollah, and that the artillery exchanges between Israel and Hezbollah, which have gone on for 6 months now, one consequence of which is that Israelis living in border towns or close to the border have had to evacuate. And I think about 170,000 of them, or 100,000, have left their homes. They're living in hotels and government-provided shelter in Israel, deeper into Israel. And the Netanyahu government have promised they'll be able to get back into their homes. They can. Now, the hesitation about taking on Hezbollah is twofold. One, Hezbollah, unlike Hamas, is a very organized and disciplined and very well-equipped military force, conventional military force. They fought in Syria on behalf of Assad's Syrian government for years. Right? And in a straight-up battle, the Israelis might lose. In any case, the Israelis could not crush them. And in addition, Hezbollah has thousands of missiles, not just drones, which they could rain on Israel. And, since the distance between the border and the Hezbollah forces, right, and where these launches are located, and the main population of Israel is very short, Israel, in effect, could be destroyed. Now, here again, the objective, or the veiled objective, is to get the United States to fight Hezbollah for them, just as they want the United States to get into an all-out war with Iran, and therefore destroy all of Israel's enemy and leave it master of the Middle East, as well as being in a position to rule all of historical Palestine. Now, of course, it's the extraordinary short-sightedness, blundering, fanaticism, and general incompetence of the Biden team that they have allowed themselves to be manipulated and placed in this position. Encouraging writing blank checks for Israel on the assumption that Israel would, at the very least, be able to deal with Gaza, right? And therefore not getting entangled with Hezbollah and Iran in ways that would force the American hand, either let Israel suffer a severe defeat or have the United States go to war on its behalf. That's the dilemma they face now. And frankly, the administration doesn't know what the hell to do. We could talk in a moment about what the Israeli quandary is, what their two unpalatable choices are. But that's the reality.
So basically, are you saying that at this point the Israelis are facing a decision between defeat in terms of their military objectives or direct American involvement? Basically, American boots on the ground fighting Israel's enemies for them. Like it's between those two options. Is that am
Well,
I
the two options are admitting defeat and coming to terms with the new reality, political, military, etc., and in a way diplomatic, or going for broke and doing two things, or one or two things, uh, retaliating against Iran with a large scale air and missile assault, right, which would then evoke response in kind by Iran, and or to launch an all-out attack on Hezbollah. In a way, what they're faced with is either impalatable deflating of all of their ambitions, the fall not just of the government, but the undermining of Israel's entire position in the region, right? Or pursuing a strategy of all or nothing. And the all, or to win the all, to achieve the all, they cannot do on their own. Can only do if the United States were to join them. And it would have to join them in the initial assault on either Hezbollah or Iran or both, because if they don't, the retaliation from Iran would be intolerable. It would create intolerable damage on Israel. And if the United States did not join them from the outset in attacking Hezbollah, then the Hezbollah response would cause almost equal damage. So they are cornered. They painted themselves upon. And I think that there's something else we should keep in mind, which is of paramount importance. There is good reason to doubt that this Israeli leadership is capable at this point of making rational decisions. They're so caught up in their own emotion, in their own, biblically, supposedly foreseen, uh, turning point in achieving all of the great, the prophecies, right? Uh, and that they seem to be sort of unable to sit down and do a cool calculus, saying, what are the possible costs? What are the possible benefits? What are the probabilities? What are the probabilities of we would get this response from Iran, that response from Hezbollah? And the key, what are the chances the Americans would indeed join us, which would give us a chance to reach our goals, or won't, in which case Israel as we know it would cease to exist. They're incapable, apparently, and people who know much more sensitive and experiment understanding of Israeli both politics and the emotional dynamics at work, they don't seem to be capable of doing that. And since they're probably incapable of accepting a new reality in which they've been thwarted in all of their aims and purposes, they are most likely to launch a rather large attack on Iran. How large, we don't know. The position of the United States is to, well, as been much discussed and is in the news and is publicly stated, is to convince the Israelis not to overreact, by which they mean don't react so massively that Iran will then respond with an equally massive and destructive attack on you. And they've also said, we're not going to participate, we're not going to foreclose the latter by participating in any initial attack that you have in mind. Right? And then they try and persuade the Iranians with the implicit assistance of Russia and China, not in that sense to overreact if the expected Israeli strike is relatively limited. Now, that's a very delicate game to play, both in terms of dovetailing the two psychologies and the two psychological reactions in Jerusalem and Tehran, uh, and second, placing confidence on your ability to persuade the Israelis to exercise restraint in their retaliation, and to persuade the Iranians to exercise restraint in how they might respond to an Israeli direct attack. Now, of course, we have zero credibility in Tehran. That's why the hope is that Moscow and Beijing, which do have good relations, uh, would counsel them that it's in their interest to be prudent and cautious. And of course, up until now, the Iranian leadership has shown itself to be prudent and cautious. Their attack on Saturday was highly sophisticated in both design and execution. They clearly have kept cool heads, and they are not being allowing themselves to be driven by emotion, as is the Netanyahu gang. What happens next? We don't know.
I wanted to ask you a question about censorship. You point out a lot. You've pointed out in your recent pieces that there's kind of this crumbling of the moral image, I guess, that the West portrays of itself with Gaza, and it seems that supporting Palestine, or at the least opposing Israel's uh, genocide in Gaza, is becoming an increasingly mainstream position in the U.S., especially among young people. Um, Despite this, though, censorship on the issue persists, most visibly on social media with journalists like Patrick Lawrence, who writes for ScheerPost, or Kit Clarenberg, who writes for the Gray Zone and Mint Press News, but also recently at me and Diego's, or mine and Diego's alma mater, USC, who just banned the Muslim valedictorian who minored in resistance to genocide, I think is the name of the minor, and openly opposes the military action in Gaza by Israel from giving her commencement address at graduation. Um, and to me, like, what this signals is another example of the erosion of the elusive officiality, or intelligence of our elite class, and the recognition of how fraudulent that is by normal people. So I wanted to ask you, is the public becoming increasingly aware of these vapid moral foundations of Western civilization that you've written about recently?
No, certainly not. From all the evidence, see, you know, personally, I find the most disturbing, if not the most dangerous, feature of this whole situation has been the response, the behavior, uh, verbal, diplomatic, tangible, of the political class, particularly the political elites not only in the United States, but across the Western world. Um, the way in which they have almost in knee-jerk fashion identified completely with not just Israel as such, but with the fabricated Israel picture of realities. And they're continuing to do so. And despite the horrors of Gaza, forces us to face really some fundamental questions. They said, one, is in fact there a moral void at the heart of Western civilization? And two, what has happened to what is the supposed humanistic, philosophical underlay foundations of contemporary Western societies as well as governmental institutions? Now, you can attribute the former in part to the extraordinary sort of effective lobbying, public relations campaign, etc., of organizations like AIPAC in the US, which has bought most of Congress, and people who associate with it and with the positions of AIPAC provide the bulk of the financing for presidential campaigns, particularly the Democratic Party. You have a sort of less powerful analog in France, but not in the rest of Western Europe. So their reaction requires further explanation. But let's come back, stick to the United States for a moment. At the current time, as you well know, you have a dozen members of the House of Representatives who are bold enough to even support a ceasefire. You have one and a half senators. Bernie Sanders, who came to that position about halfway through this crisis, and last week, Elizabeth Warren. Elizabeth Warren, who voted to cut off funding to the UN relief organization in Gaza, U.S. funding. Right? You have mainstream media, without exception, following the Israeli line and deceiving us through outright lies, through lies by omission, through various deceptive practices, knowing or unwittingly. Right? And you could say, most surprising of all, what has happened to American civil society, a much vaunted civil society.
Yeah. Just one thing. I totally agree with you, and I think that it's pretty clear that the political class, that the moral foundation there, or the morality there, is being proven to be completely, vapid or fictitious. I think the question I was raising was more about, are the masses becoming aware of that? Are they basically raising the same questions that you are right now? Are these contradictions becoming more evident to regular people? Because I remember that just a few years ago, I think that if people said that they weren't going to vote for Biden and they were instead going to vote for a third party, then you were a racist or you were a white supremacist, even sometimes people would say. But now I think a lot of those same people are coming out and screaming at Joe Biden every appearance that he makes in public, calling him Genocide Joe, and his support is tanking among the Democratic voters. So, to me, I think a lot of that is attributed to not the mainstream media's coverage, but citizen journalists in Gaza who have been posting these horrific
Right.
videos since the beginning of the onslaught. That because you've had this Democratic Party that has positioned itself as a friend to people of color, not substantively but rhetorically, right? They're constantly calling the Republicans racist and fascist and
Right.
even white supremacist. And then it's kind of hard to then now make that argument that you're the non-racist party for brown and black and working class people when you're enabling and funding and aiding the genocide of an indigenous population, right? Do you think people are waking up to that, or no?
Well, it's hard to know because, I mean, opinion surveys only get responses from, the top of people's heads. You don't know the saliency of what behind what they say or what box they check and so on. We do know, I mean, that there's a natural sort of human revulsion at the kinds of atrocities being committed in Gaza, which is really rooted in human nature, especially if you yourself and your group are not directly, concretely involved. When you're more inclined to totally demonize and dehumanize the energy, the way we did the Japanese in World War II. Right? But this is not our fight. We're not fighting Palestinians in any sense, right? So, yes, you probably do have a number of puzzling things about the Western reaction, most specifically in the United States, and when we can just sort of talk a bit about Western, Europe. We were saying that, currently public opinion by at least a 2-to-1 margin favors a true ceasefire, not this sort of phony pause. Give them a snack before you kill them. Policy of the Biden administration. But that doesn't translate really into political action, into political pressure. It's more in the nature of an instinctive human reaction to horror, to atrocity, which is really rooted in our nature and genealogy. And of course, the farther away the people are from you, ethnically, geographically, religiously, the more abstract it becomes. And in that sense, there is an element of racism. It's not racism in the form of hatred of Palestinians, Arabs, or Muslims, except for very few people. It's just that's how we sort of differentiate our responses and the way we deal with certain groups based upon how familiar we are with them and how distant they are. But generally speaking, there still is an instinctive reaction, as we said, when you see human beings being slaughtered, being suffered, etc., no matter who they are. And I think that is reflected in the 70% of Americans who call for a ceasefire. But this has not cut very deeply into American political class or political elites. And that's really a fascinating and troubling question as to why. If you look at the government, that is the Biden administration and Congress, there's some cold political calculations and some other self-interested factors. The Democrats feel that they cannot win this election, which seems to be, going to go down to the wire again, without a large war chest, which is provided by people who would cut off the flow if the U.S. were to reverse its position on Israel, Palestine, Gaza. You could counter that by saying, look, Joe Biden is committing suicide by alienating a significant portion of habitual Democratic voters, particularly the younger and the more progressive. And that would be fatal in what is likely to be a close election. So, you're committing suicide if you take that route as well. I don't think these people are sophisticated enough, either intellectually or even in terms of political smarts, despite how the extent to which they promote themselves as all pros, etc. I think they're politically stupid as well as stupid in terms of estimates of American national interest and what constitutes a responsible foreign policy. And the money factor, of course, plays even more in Congress, where the notion you might win an election based upon what you say and do, rather than basing it on the number of TV ads you take, is considered to be so retro as not to be taken into serious account at all. But beyond that, I think that a political class in the foreign policy community, if you can use that term, has over the last 20 to 30 or 30 to 20 years locked itself into a strategic vision which no longer is viable in terms of actual realities, if it ever was. And if you want to, what are the underlying elements of it? Well, you have to go back to the notorious Paul Wolfowitz memo of March 1991, when he was in the Bush, the senior administration, in which he laid out a plan, very cold-blooded, as to what the United States could and should do to maintain global dominance with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it was comprehensive. And one of its elements was, one, it was global. Two, you would use all of the instruments of power and influence at your disposal. Three, you would act preventively to prevent the possibility of any power arising who might challenge you. And while it was considered embarrassing at the time, that has in fact become the intellectual foundation stone of the country's thinking, and certainly the political elites thinking about the United States' place in the world. It then was infused with and took on another dimension when it was able to absorb neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, who supposedly idealistically foresaw a world of functional economic independence, the spread of democracy, ushering in a new age, the end of history, and blah, 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 if you like. And what we've seen is a fusion of these two strands, if you like, and with heavy emphasis and leaning towards sort of, the Wolfowitz conception, as neoliberalism begins to lose its credibility, and as the neoliberal bet has been lost thanks to the rise of China as an American economic, equal, if you like. And of course, this conforms very much with our American collective sense of having born under a providential star, destined to lead the world towards, a better future, right? And the American sense of exceptionalism, mission superiority, etc., is the emotional dynamic behind this. And so you take these two, this sort of geo-strategic, audacious, global empire building idea with a sense of American moral mission, and you get the brew now, which has been drunk and absorbed by almost the entire American political class. And I think that's the framework, intellectual, doctrinal, political, in which we have to place American foreign policy uh, over the current American foreign policy going back some years. That's really, to my mind, a frame of reference in which we have to place it in order to understand the pigheadedness, the stubbornness, the refusal to adjust to realities which contradict your underlying assumption as to how the world works and the degree to which you can work your will within it. So, part of our dilemma, leaving aside for the moment the moral dimension, is that we're living in a fantasy world, which we not only can't escape, we don't want to escape from, because it means downplaying and diminishing the whole American collective sense of self. And I think that's the pathological psychology we're dealing with, and that only partly explains why, at the same time, in the face of what's happening now, Gaza, we have become, in terms of morality, totally numb in how all our humanistic instincts have been numb. Because if you act on those instincts and you call, the truth, right? Then that means a change in your thinking about Israel. It means a change in your thinking about Arabs, and maybe even thinking about changing your demonizing of Russia and China, and we to be unable for emotional, psychological, as well as intellectual reasons to go down that road. And there is nobody in the country with any visibility. There's some very admirable people, and incredibly able, responsible people, some of them who used to hold very high positions in government, who provide a devastating sort of critique of where we are. But they're invisible. You have to go on certain marginal websites to see them and to hear them.
So I'm just curious. Do you think like these people who are important decision makers, who are always speaking in front of the media, the Secretary of State, the spokespeople in the State Department, all these people, do you think they really buy into this narrative and all these sort of I think you call them fictions that in one of your articles have gained currency amongst all these kind of heads of government, and you're referring to 9/11, Russian election interference, war with China, Putin as this dictator. Do you think that like this genuine all these narratives that built it, that they have a genuine belief in them, or is it all like a cynical ploy that is very intentional?
Some of it is pure cynicism, right? Some of it is genuine conviction that yes, this is a tough, nasty, competitive world, and we're going to do everything we can to remain top dog and to keep everybody subordinate. There are others who simply are unable or unwilling to accept and to adapt the realities that America's self-conception and its supposed sort of idealism doesn't match up with reality, either of what the world is or what our government is doing. And then you have the element of careerism. Look, if you write for the New York Times, if you are any of the cable news or network news people and so forth, you know in your bones where the boundaries are. And if you want to keep your job and your career, you don't even want to get close to that. It's like, it becomes instinctive, almost like going down into the New York City subway. Even if they didn't paint the yellow line, instinctively, you're not going to get too close to the edge of the platform. And some people I'd say instinctively, with varying degrees of self-awareness. But let's face it, self-awareness is not exactly a distinctive a trait of contemporary American culture, right? We're so self-regarding and so selfish, if you want, so narcissistically, self-awareness. And if there's a superego, which is strictly national superego, principles of humanism are not part of that superego for the vast majority of people. And look, let's come back to that point about civic society. You look at it and you say, well, you run through, look at the churches. The Pope made a heartfelt statement about Gaza. It's had zero resonance in the American Catholic hierarchy, as far as I know. You look at the mainline Protestant denominations, none of them spoke in that, neither individually nor in aggregate under the umbrella of the National Council of Churches. It's as if they exhausted their reservoir of humanistic feeling by the coddling of transgenders, which makes them feel good and great and virtuous. Right? Media, we've done. Look at professional associations. Do any of them speak up? No. Medical associations. How about the gross violations of international law? Do the bar associations? No, nothing. And the universities, of course, cower, totally intimidated. And in fact, as you mentioned, you have this almost sort of scythe-like movement, through the universities, trying to cut down and cut off anyone who as much as voices criticism of Israeli behavior in Gaza, and you label them anti-Semites. I mean, it's because university, you fellows are probably too young to remember a time when university presidents, particularly in most prestigious universities, were actually recognizable public figures. Often, not often, but occasionally would speak on great national issues. These days, you don't even know the names of these people. They're a bunch of non-entities, mediocrities. Let's look at their performance and how their boards of trustees in reaction to their roasting by the congressional committee. And the people themselves, one, they got very bad legal advice to the way they were trying to cut and trim, and they opened some themselves up, which was ridiculous in a way. But don't you look at these people? I mean, they're not formidable personalities in any respect. And so they get you're disposed of like Kleenex, and the region's trustees bring in another non-entity. You look at the USC incident. It's a sad commentary on the contemporary state of American society in several of its dimensions. In a way, you can argue that. I mean, a lot of this is been visible for 20 years or so in terms of turns in American foreign policy and also some of these social cultural deformities. Right? But in a way, what this unexpected Gaza crisis has done, it's like it's like a die that you place in and runs through the body politic of the United States, and it highlights all of the organs and how they're functioning. And that's what this has done. And you take the X-ray, you don't need an X-ray, and you watch it through and you see all this highlighted and you say, oh my God, nothing looks very healthy. So where you go from here, I don't know. don't fancy myself, a prophet. You can get all excited about choosing between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, but that's not going to answer anything.
Yeah.
It's, it's just a question how things are going to get worse.
Yeah. That actually wraps in perfectly to the last question I wanted to ask you. Because while I have seen and heard more and more people opting out of the whole argument of Trump or Biden,
Hmm.
I still hear a good amount of people online and friends at times, but mostly not people in my personal life. Usually people online, but some people in my personal life that are saying, well, I don't like Biden, and I think what he's doing in Gaza is terrible, but we better vote for him because everything is going to get so
Yeah.
much worse for Palestinians and for us if Trump gets elected. And in your recent article that we published or that we posted at Cheerpost, you lay out like a lot of the egregious stuff that Republicans do on a domestic level in terms of, I think you said that they will not even accept Medicaid expansions and things like that on a state level,
Hmm.
and they're to cutting social programs and etc. But the Democrats seem like they kind of run on this issue of the Republicans being so bad. And then once they get in power, they don't reverse any of the things that the Republicans did. They don't cement anything to prevent them from doing it next time around that they win. And then the Republicans kind of seem like they need the Democrats as well to be these epic failures every time they get in. So then they can say, oh, we're remember us? These guys suck too. So it's almost like they're feeding off of each other in a way, and it seems to me like the whole election season is kind of a distraction in a way. And um, do you think that this situation in Gaza and that dynamic of the Republicans doing all these things, but then the Democrats doing nothing to reverse them or to change anything? Uh, do you think it shows that these two parties almost maybe not intentionally, but at least effectively are working together to kind of keep the status quo in place?
No, no, not obviously not working together consciously, but what each does reinforces the allegiance of those who strongly identify with the other. And, it's like watching two political parties competing who wins in a contest to commit suicide. Yeah. And here they're different personalities. I mean, the Democrats have been committing suicide since the Reagan days. Right? And the Democrats do it, by 1,000 cuts. And it takes them generations. I mean, they're not quite on life support, but in terms of representing, what an America could and should be, pretty close to it, if you like. Republicans, on the other hand, they grab the sword and rush at the monsters that they see coming at them. And, either you slay the monster and you get into the White House, or you think of the monster, uh, or the trouble is, they try to commit suicide. They haven't always slain the monster. And yet, the other guy is still busy, slowly cutting his wrists rather than seizing the opportunity to control the territory. I mean, it's morbid and it's tragic. So, and unfortunately, in the United States, there's no opportunity really for third parties for all kinds of reasons. We know. But what's also interesting to me is that there is no impetus really towards forming something that constitutes a serious break. It would have to be a break from the Democratic Party. Of course, there has been a break in the Republican side. Now it's taken over by, crackpots, neo-fascists, and all that. And yeah, I mean, it is true. If you talk about, whether to vote expediently, yeah, I mean, if Trump is reelected, then we're fully in a world of post-constitutional America. The game is up. Where we would wind up on the autocracy scale, nobody knows. But the America that was founded and we knew is at an end. On the other hand, the argument, therefore, for voting for Biden is to avoid that and to allow the gradual deterioration of the moral fiber of American society to weaken and unravel with the hope that something could arrest the process. But that said, no assault on the two-party system have any effect unless you have some people, and usually led by one person, of enormous conviction, ability, articulateness, and absolute courage. Now go back to 1992. What was distinctive about 1992?
Ross Perot.
Yeah. Now, Ross Perot was an absolute oddball, a very talented person as a businessman, totally idiosyncratic. And he won 19% of the vote. And not at a time of great national crisis, neither internal or external. How did he do it? He did it by bluntly saying some truths or things that people thought were truths that should be said. And there's some about the most mundane is very serious thing. Yeah, he was a great critic of NAFTA. And he also been out saying he got a seat on the board of General Motors because his company, which was a data processing company, had a big contract with them. He had a seat. And he said, I'd sit in the meeting. This was when the American car industry was really at its nadir. Not that it's risen that far since, but anyway, it was really at its nadir. And he recounts how he told them, guys, at least let's try and be number one at something, even if it's ashtrays. And he said a lot of things like that, which really endeared himself to people and resonated. And on that basis, the guy with these big ears and funny accent got 19% of the vote.
I'm not sure. What do you mean? What were the sentiments of the truths that he was speaking that got him 19% of the vote? I don't.
Well, it's still something because nobody pays any attention to it because it's considered so aberrant and idiosyncratic, and nobody's drawn any lessons from it. Either candidates from the two main parties or some kind of rebel. But the point is, I think the relevant point is that there is nobody out there you could even imagine doing what Ross Perot did. Whatever the political found, he had no real ideology or philosophy. Now, in a way, Trump in 2016 was something of an emulation in that he broke every rule of the game. In what he said, how he said it, in terms of insulting people. And that, frankly, apart from the substance of his maniacal views, was part of his attraction. And there are all kinds of people who voted for him on that basis. Now, of course, now that's all consolidated and we're in another sort of aberrant mode. But can you think of any Democrat doing anything like that in a more noble cause?
Thank you, Dr. Brenner, so much for joining us on this episode of Journalists for Sale. Do you have any upcoming work that you'd like to plug, or any place where people can find you besides your posts?
No, unfortunately, I don't have a site and I don't blog. The things I write get picked up in various places, including Shia Post, Consortium News. Um, I do a number of interviews and with different people, including one in Japan, one in Brazil,